Hi, readers. Welcome to Books Connect Us from Penguin Random House. This is a podcast about staying connected with each other and the stories and authors who inspire us. Don Bentley spent a decade as an Army Apache helicopter pilot, and while deployed in Afghanistan, was awarded the Bronze Star and the Air Medal with V device for valor. He is the author of novels such as The Outside Man and Without Sanction, and the new Jack Ryan Jr. thriller, Target Acquired. In the book, Jack helps a woman and her young son and finds himself the target of trained killers. Alone and outgunned, Jack will have to use his skills to protect the life of a child. Now let's join the book's editor, Tom Colgan, in conversation with author Don Bentley.
Hey, so I'm Tom Colgan. I'm an editorial director at Berkeley, and I am here with the wonderful Don Bentley, who is a terrific author of mine. I'm very proud to be involved with Don, and I have been for a couple of years now. And we're here to talk about his second book, The Outside Man. But before we get to that, I just want to ask you a question, Don.
Sure.
So your protagonist is this guy, Matt Drake, who is a defense intelligence operative. And, I think it's interesting that you picked that because, so many other books that I get in are about CIA agents, what have
Sure.
you. So tell us about Matt. Why'd you pick him?
I appreciate that. I think I usually ascribe everything wise in my life to Tom Colgan, but since you're the one doing the interview, I'll say that Nick Petrie told me this. So in all seriousness, when I was writing this book, and it took me 3 books that didn't sell to write Without Sanction that did sell, I got some great advice that said, what you need to do is bring to this genre something that's the same but different. And the same in that it should belong on the shelf, hopefully next to Mark Graney or Brad Taylor or any of those fantastic writers, but different because Mark Graney is already the best Mark Graney writer there is, and you don't need to be another Mark Graney. And so what I did is I really took a hard look at what was going on in the espionage kind of military thriller genre. And there were, as you mentioned, there are a lot of awesome characters that are special operations folks or CIA case officers or operatives or anything. But when it was an FBI agent in my prior life, and I got to rub shoulders with a lot of interesting folks from other intelligence agencies. And I thought, it might be really neat to take a guy from the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, because it's an agency much like the CIA. It has a very similar mission. And a lot of times it's actually in conflict with the CIA for funding, for mission sets. And I thought, that might be neat to take this character and put him in an agency that folks aren't quite as familiar with, that maybe has some built-in conflict as part of it because of the agency's mission. And then the second aspect of it is I made Matt Drake a first-person protagonist for much of the same reason. One of the huge influences on me is Nelson DeMille, and in particular, Nelson DeMille's John Corey series, and that really voicey, witty first-person protagonist. And again, I thought, if I could bring some of that or do something a little bit different, maybe that would help me kind of carve out that niche. And then the third part of the answer to your question is, while I've done some interesting things in my career, the biggest blessing is that I got to hang out with a lot of interesting people. And so some of my closest friends are from the Ranger Regiment, and they subscribe to a particular belief that's known as the Ranger Creed that plays very heavily in Without Sanction. And so that was another one where I thought, when I look across the cast of characters that's out there right now, there isn't one who is a former Ranger or that figures prominently in their character development. So kind of took all those 3 things together, and Matt Drake is what came out of that.
Okay. Well, fair enough. So tell us about this book. Tell us about The Outside Man. What's the plot? What's the story? What's going on?
Sure. So again, when I was an FBI agent, one of my jobs was to run and recruit what we call sources and what folks in the intelligence community call assets. And again, was privileged to work with some pretty interesting people and rub shoulders with some pretty interesting people. And so folks that do this job, like Matt Drake for the intelligence community, oftentimes or the majority of the times work overseas. And many times when they work overseas, they work under a legend or a cover, and that the name that they use is certainly not the one that they use back home. And I remember talking to a friend about that who actually did that job. And he described this almost emotional release that happened when he would set foot on U.S. soil again, because he knew everything that happened over there. It happened under a different name. And in theory, it was completely separate from his life back in the States, which a lot of times if folks are operating under non-official cover as Knox, they have a completely different life that they live here in the States. And then when they get on that airplane, they are a different person working for a different company, doing different things. And so that just kind of triggered in my head, what Matt does that. So Matt Drake works overseas. He's a case officer, primarily what he does there. But wouldn't it be interesting if that world that he thought was segregated by an ocean somehow followed him back home? And then you'd have the collision of those two things that he's worked his entire life to keep separate. And so that was kind of the nexus of the outside man.
Okay. One of the things we say in it, I'm going to give you like a little inside baseball thing about editorial. One of the things we say in editorial is that the most important book in an author's career is the second book, not the first one, because you've had 20 years or whatever to write your first book, or at least think about it, and you get so excited and you sell it, and you're all the way up here in excitement, and then your editor says to you, okay, now you got 12 months to do the second one, so you go from up here to down here. So like, what was that like? I mean, was that energizing for you, or did like panic breed success? I mean, how did that work for you?
Well, fortunately for me, my editor is great at giving these Braveheart. Yes. And he gives these amazing Braveheart speeches where he says, basically just, rub some dirt on it and get up and write the next book is pretty much, I think.
I'm wearing a kilt right now.
I think, everybody asks that. And I think for me, one of the big things is that, as you said, not only do you have your entire life to write the first book, but for me, it wasn't until it was my fourth book that actually sold. So as I was writing it, I wasn't worried about anyone reading it because, in my head, I wasn't sure whether anybody really would, right? Because nobody had the first three. And so the second one, somebody's going to read that. And that can both be incredibly motivating and then incredibly crippling if you let it get in your mind. And there were parts as I was writing The Outside Man. And again, I'm a glutton for punishment. So I'm the guy that goes through and reads all my Goodreads reviews and Amazon reviews and stuff like that. I know. Never do that. But there were parts where I was writing The Outside Man where I really just had to stop and say, okay, I need to just think about that. I'm trying to write a really good story and not be thinking about what you're going to think about it, what the reader's going to think about it, what anybody else, and especially in that first draft, because it's that part is such, I don't even know the right word for it. Like the book is so fragile in the first draft phase, right? Because you're still trying to figure it out. You're still trying to figure out what the beats of it are. I remember watching interviews with Tom Clancy, and they would always try to get him to talk about the book he was writing at the time. Like at the end of the interview, what are you working on? And he was steadfast in the fact that he would never talk about it because it's like taking fuel out of the rocket. If you talk about it as you're working on it, suddenly it makes it less real. And I felt a little bit about that, right? Because that's the other thing when you go, I'm that overnight success that took 17 years and 3 books that didn't sell to finally sell one. When people find out you're writing the second one out of good nature, they're like, hey, what's it about? And as soon as you start to talk about that, as soon as you start to think about the book, at least in my case, when it's not yet out of that first draft or not, it can be really deadly for it. And so I did have to, for a while, kind of get out of the way and do it. But I've been so fortunate. One of the things about it taken me a little bit longer is the network of friends and fellow writers that I developed. And there were many times, I think Nick Petrie should get paid a psychologist fee or something, because I would call him up and he'd put me on the couch for an hour and just wax poetically to me for a while. and Mark Graney would say, it's going to be all right. And Brad Taylor would say, just get up and write the book. So, between all three of those, it ended up being an all right experience, I think.
That's 3 very different kinds of therapy you must have been bouncing around.
Exactly.
Between the 3 of them. Well, I mean, but when you're writing it, I mean, any book,
Mhm.
the first book without sanction, the first book, the second book without the outside man. So you write that first draft. Does that change a
Yep.
lot usually? I mean, do you
Yeah.
chuck a lot of that out and then, go in a different path, or like, how do you do that?
I do, and I think you and I have talked about it before, that I kind of write more organically. I know there are folks like Kyle Mills talks about when he's writing a Mitch Rapp book. I think his outline is like 40 or 50,000 words, like just his outline. And Mark Cameron, who's phenomenal writer, like I see his outlines and they're very, very detailed. And for me, it becomes really, really hard to try and figure out where a story is going to go and to just craft it down. And Stephen James has a great book called Story Trumps Structure, where he talks
Mhm.
about this process. And so as I write through, I try and think to myself, what would make things more difficult for the protagonist? How can I up the tension here?
Mhm.
How can I take the stakes further? And so you don't, in my opinion, you don't get out of the work of doing an outline, right, or proving it. You just have to do that work on the back end. And so for me, I end up usually throwing a lot of words out, or trying to go back for my second draft and organizing it and trying to get it to flow together better. But I think for me, it keeps it fresher, and it keeps it, if I can't figure out what's going to happen to Matt next, or Jack Ryan Jr. or something, maybe the reader doesn't either, and we can keep pushing that for him. So that's what I try and do. It doesn't always work out according to plan, though.
I mean, how far have you ever got? How far have you gotten ever with like a plot line or subplot or something
Sure.
where you were like, oh wow, I got to go back 20,000 words and zig instead of zag?
Yeah. So I've my wife is my first reader, and we were high school sweethearts, and so she's read everything I've ever written. Has a very, very good sense of both story and it's me as a writer. And there have been more than one occasion where what I like to try and do is, as I'm going through the first draft, I really like the Save the Cat book and that mentality, the different beats that a story has. And I'll lay that out and try and think, okay, I've got the first act down. I think I'll have what I call like a scene bullpen, where I'm saving things that hey, this would be a great fight scene later. This would be a great plot twist. And so I kind of have that in the back of my mind and look to work it in. But there have been times where she'll find me when I get to the point where I'm doing that. I've got note cards spread all over the dining room table, and I've got my head in my hands, and I'm like, I'm here, and I wrote this out of order, and I can't figure out how to get those things together. And so, I was talking with you earlier with the first Jack Ryan Jr. book I did. I ended up throwing out probably 30 or 40,000 words because I
Mhm.
went down a path and then had to pull it back. And so that's something too that I'm trying to get better at as a writer, is to write more efficiently. And I think one of hopefully my secrets to sauce is that when you write multiple POV books like that, you have to, or I'm more successful if I stick with the protagonist point of view and carry it most of the way through the book, or at least to key plot points, before I go back and add the second POV or the third POV character, because that's usually what I end up wasting. Is I've written a whole POV character or scenes in it that I don't really need anymore, and you don't really know
Mhm.
that you don't need them until you've carried that protagonist through the book, perhaps.
Okay, so let's go to that. So
Yep.
Tom Clancy, a very smart person, asked you to write this Tom Clancy book
A
with
very
me.
smart person.
Yes. So you're writing your first Tom Clancy book, Tom Clancy Target
Yep.
Acquired, which comes out in June of 2021.
Yep.
How was that different? And B, do you think, like, now that you're writing your third Matt Drake book, are you coming up from a different angle, having written a Jack Ryan Jr. book?
Yeah, so it was incredibly humbling to get offered that opportunity. Like I said, I think we all as readers have books that were kind of inflection points in our reading career, and for me, it was Red Storm Rising. Like my best friend down the street when I was 13 or 14, he's like, "You got to read this book," and I still remember Tom Clancy putting you in the cockpit of this F-14 as you're doing strafing runs on the Russian cargo ship that had pulled up, and it was like I knew I was reading it, but in my head I was like, I can't believe this isn't real. Like I can't believe this isn't happening. And what 14-year-old kid, like that was for me about the same time Top Gun came out and everything, like what 14-year-old kid doesn't want to sit in the cockpit of an F-14? And so when I got the chance to write the Jack Ryan Jr., I talked to Mark Graney quite a bit. I talked to Mike Madden and talked to Mark Cameron. And one of the things Mark Cameron said to me, which I would attribute to you, except for you're on the call, is he said that he's like, you remember Tom Clancy a certain way. And he said, but you're really remembering that through the lens or the prism of the books that you read right now. And he said, I bet if you went back and read Tom Clancy books, his older ones or his beginning ones, you would still like them, but they are different than you remember them. And I was like, I'm going to try that. And he was right. You know, a lot of the times the pacing was slower than I remember. He did things and still magnificent books, but completely different than what I remembered. And, you know, you gave me some great advice too that said, hey, don't try and be Tom Clancy, bring your writing to that universe. And so what I did do is I read, you know, Debt of Honor, I read Cardinal in the Kremlin, I reread 4 or 5 of them. And I had a little notebook where I'd write down, these are the things that I loved about this book, both as a kid and I still love now. And what does he do that I could bring to the Jack Ryan Jr. book? And so that was, I had kind of that notebook of things that I wanted to do. And part of what I think Tom did so well, and Mark and Mike and Mark do as well, is the things that you wish you could see, kind of like being in the cockpit of that F-14 again, the things that you would love to experience and are cool, Tom put you there. And so that was kind of my mandate as I was writing it is, well, first off, I don't want to mess this up because there are some incredible people who have written these before me. And then the second thing is like, what are the things that, because I love that genre, I love that stuff. When I see a link about a particular military piece of technology or gear or something that would make me click on it and read about it, what could I bring of that kind of energy to this book? And so that's what I tried to do. And it was, I told you, it was the most, for me, the most complicated thing I've ever done. And again, some Tom Colgan wisdom is that you have some incredible writers that write for you. And one of the things that you said is what makes a great writer or sets a great writer apart from a good writer is that a great writer never rests on his or her laurels, and they will try something different from every book. Like Mark Graney writing in first person with his last Gray Man book. And so for me, I had some things that were very, very hard to do in the climax of this book. And I almost pitched one of them out completely. And it's like, it's too hard. I can't do it. And I had like your voice whispering in my ear a little bit. And I'm like, I'm going to see if I can make this work. It's going to be. And so I had note cards spread all over the floor in my office. I had all of these things going on, and it managed to come together. And I think the writer of me, the last book, I would have given up on it and taken the easier way out. And so I think coming back full circle to your question for my third Matt book, one thing that was really cool is it was interesting coming back to Matt after writing Jack Ryan Jr. because it felt like coming home again. Like it was a completely different character and everything, but it felt like, okay, now, because it was another thing you have to do with the Clancy universe is really understand characters that you didn't bring to life. And so it was fun to kind of make that transition. But then in the back of my head too, I thought, all right, what am I going to do to try and challenge myself in this book that I've never done before too? Like, how can I push the envelope further with this book? And so that's kind of what is a really long answer to your very short question.
No, but it's a good answer. It's a good answer to the question. Honestly, I'm curious to read the third book because I am interested to see how living in the Clancy universe for 6 months will have changed, how you approach the Matt universe. It's a whole, I don't need to tell you, it's a whole different thing. Like you said, when you're writing somebody else's characters, because you get this much of a span of how much, how far apart or what you can do with them, right? Whereas with Matt, you can do anything you want because he's your character, and that's always very interesting. So, you've already mentioned about being an FBI agent, but you were also an Apache helicopter pilot in Afghanistan and Iraq. So how did that influence Matt or any of your writing?
Yeah, so maybe twofold. So the first part for Matt, especially in Without Sanction, and then it's kind of carried forward in The Outside Man, is that When I was an Apache helicopter in Afghanistan, I was a part of an operation that went tragically wrong. And so that experience is certainly, unfortunately, not unique to me. It's something that I think a lot of folks who have served have gone through. And so I really wanted to pull that into Matt. There's some great, so like Nick Petrie's Peter Ash character, for instance, has got the post-traumatic stuff that he's dealing with. Brad Taylor's Pike Logan, when he first started, was a very broken guy. Mark Graney has done some really neat things with Court Gentry. And I think in this genre, you have to bring something to the character that makes them more than just two-dimensional, that makes them more relatable, that they have, because what they do for the most part is very, very superhuman. So you have to bring something, right, that has that humanity in there too. And so that part certainly impacted it. I think the second part, and again, this isn't an experience that's unique to me, is that when you're in the military, you have this sense of being a part of something that's noble, that's bigger than you, that matters. And then when you leave that and a lot of times go into your first non-military job, where it's still very important, but it's, I was working for a company and came on to the team, and we're going, for a quarter close to make this number, and we make this number and everybody high fives, and then you start for the next number. And I remember thinking, like, that's it, that's what we do here. And it was, and so I and when you're coming to that realization is usually when you're completely separate from anyone else who could understand what you have been through and done it. And I remember having conversations with Ange, with my wife, where she wasn't this blunt, but in my head I heard her saying, why aren't you happy? Like, you should be happy. We're done with this. We have this great life here. Everything's good, but you're not good. Why? Like, why is this not good anymore? You're not getting shot at. You're not deploying, or whatever. And so I wanted to kind of grab onto that too and bring it into the outside man. And Matt very much starts that way with the outside man, where he's no longer a part of the Defense Intelligence Agency and everything should be perfect, and it's not. And he can't even articulate to his wife why it's not. And so that part definitely brought to my books as well. I think the other part is, and again, going back to the fun stuff or the things that people don't see, there's a big section in the outside man that I very much draw upon what I did as an Apache pilot. And that's just a really neat thing that people who haven't served or haven't done that never get a chance to. And man, if we can show them that, or show them a little sliver of that world, I think that's part of the reason why people pick up these books, hopefully.
I think it is. I think they definitely pick it up for that insider information. I mean, one of the things I used to say to authors all the time, I shouldn't be talking because this should be your thing, but let me just say, one of the things I said to authors all the time is, readers are more interested in the little things. They're more interested in knowing, like, I don't know what, that you take a cough drop before you get on, you go on your mission because of whatever, than they are in knowing, like, the planning of the mission or something. Because they can't imagine that the cough drop might be important. But if it is, they're like, oh, that's cool. I never knew that. So.
No, that's exactly right. Brad Taylor says this thing that when he does his travel research, he's going to a country and 40% is what he's looking to find, and 60% finds him there. And it's something he would have never thought about. And I do the same thing. Like, I'm fortunate to have a number of folks who are way more interesting than me. And one of the guys that I use all the time was a member of the Delta Force for a long period of time. And so I'll ask him a question or read a scene, but I'll never let him just type, messages back. I want to talk to him about it. And a lot of it, like you're saying, it's some minutia detail or something. You're like, man, that just adds such veracity to it. And it's not just like a, hey, here's a cool guy thing. It just grounds the scene and provides what was, when I wrote it, that was still very hazy and vague, to now it's okay. Now I can see it. And now, I can smell what that smelled like, or I can feel what that does. And I think that's what we, going back to you didn't term it as lazy writers versus non-lazy writers, but I'll term
there are no lazy writers. Anyone who can write a book is not lazy. It's too.
But I think by default, we writers want to put in the least amount of work possible, and so I think I think when you have those kind of things that let you take what's a hazy scene and then ground it into something, we got to put in the work and do that for the readers.
Good. Well, speaking of work, I mean, how has it been working during the pandemic? Have you found it easier to work or harder to work, or do you have more time or less time? I mean, what's going on?
I think, well, there's this great piece of literature that has kept me grounded, and it's called the Journal of the Plague that my favorite editor puts out every day. And sometimes I swear that's the only way I know that a day has passed, is I look at the top of it and see a different one. But one of the things is, as goofy as it sounds, is that Nick Petrie, Bill Schweigert, Graham Brown, and I get together, in about once a month or once every 6 weeks and stuff. And we have a beer, all virtually. We talk about writing. We talk, and that, like, because I didn't realize how much the sense of community was a part of what I did, and that you depend on when stuff like Thriller Fest and BoucherCon and all of those things get canceled, and you can't see, because at the end of that conference, you're like sucking everybody else's brain dry, and you get to hang out with a bunch of great writers who are where you are or better. And when you don't have that, it sucks you dry in some ways. It feels like you're lacking creativity. And so having that with those four guys has been incredibly helpful in getting through the pandemic. And then the Journal of the Plague. I mean, what else can I say?
Well, speaking of other authors, I mean, look, give us a recommendation. What have you read recently that's worth everybody's time?
So I am very, very excited about reading American Trader by Brad Taylor, but he's as is problematic in this genre is that I am putting it on the shelf because I know it has something to do with China, and I'm looking at something to do with China, and it's all of us are looking at the same things, right? And your minds start to think alike, and so it's super hard not to be derivative. The other genre that I love is fantasy, and in particular urban fantasy. And so Jim Butcher, his Harry Dresden files are fantastic. And that guy, it was 2 books ago, but I just read it recently, called Peace Talks. And he is a study in figuring out how to amp tension up with every single chapter. And that book, even like I said, is completely outside my genre. Every chapter he cranks the stakes higher, and he cranks it, and like I could feel my chest compress. And I thought, man, how is he doing this? And I actually reread that book 2 or 3 times. And so he's a fantastic writer. And just, I think his thrillers, when you talk to other thriller writers too, like I know Brad says he reads a lot of crime fiction. I know Nick Petrie reads other things besides just crime fiction. I think you have to find something outside of your genre too that you resonate with, that you can also grab hold of. And for me, a lot of times it's fantasy, and it's Jim Butcher in particular. You can't go wrong with him.
I just read, I'm terrible with titles, was The Breaker, right? Is The Breaker?
Yeah, Nick, The Breaker is Nick's
that was
newest
great.
one. Yeah, he's phenomenal.
Fantastic.
He did that, not to give it away, but his opening sequence, I was convinced I knew what was going on and what was happening. He completely took it a different direction that I would have never seen coming. He's such a good writer. That's the best thing. That is absolutely the best, is when you think, you're patting yourself on the back, like, here we go. And then you're like, I got this.
You're like,
what are you going to do, Nick? And then you turn the page, and you're like, holy crap.
Yeah, I did not see that coming. That's great. Well, anyway, listen, Don, thank you so much. This has been great, very helpful. Yeah. I've learned a lot. And good luck with Outside Man, which comes out tomorrow. So people should rush out and get them a copy of it. We're looking forward to it.
Thank you.
All right, great.
Thank you for listening to Books Connect Us. For more great book recommendations and information about your favorite authors, feel free to follow Penguin Random House on social media or visit penguinrandomhouse.com. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard, go ahead and leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, as it helps more listeners to find our show. This podcast is produced by Pat Stango and edited by Clayton Gumbert. I've been Erin Leaf, and until next time, this has been Books Connect Us.